Well, hello, everybody. Pastor Kevin here, bringing you this session's group curriculum guidance. We are in the chapter entitled Caesar's Tax, starting on page 16. And let's jump right in. Question number 1. Do you scoff at taxes, or are you more indifferent? Why? Well, this is your classic icebreaker. It's about taxes, but the real question under the question that you'll end up seeing along the way here is this really about taxes? As you read this interaction between Jesus and the Pharisees, you're going to see that it's really not, while the question is about taxes, the Pharisees are trying to get at something and Jesus is trying to get at something different as well. So, but think about it. Like, are you, whenever you talk about taxes, it's always it's the whole like politics and religion discussions. People get pretty up in arms sometimes when you start talking about taxes. But anyway, so it's just kind of identifying there might be people in your group that are the ones that are like, stupid taxes. And there might be others that have a different attitude. Just open the conversation that way. I guess one thing to be careful of is making sure that conversation doesn't alienate before you try to get into the other things. If you think it will, skip the question. The whole point of the icebreaker is to get you guys connected in dialogue so that there's already you already have a jumping off ground to start getting into deeper and deeper items within the session, okay? Question number 2. Have you ever had someone try to entangle you in words? Have you done the same? Describe a situation. What is the typical goal of such a strategy? You may have had this happen either at home or at work or at school, where where you can tell when someone's asking you a question, they are looking for a particular response so that they can grab part of it and try to seize an opportunity on it. And maybe you have, in fact, not maybe, I think in some way, shape, or form, we tend to do this, where when you come into a conversation or a dialogue with a goal in mind. I'm going to have a conversation with someone because I want them to do something, or I want them to agree to something, or whatever it is. When you go with that in mind, oftentimes your questions are like chess pieces. You are actually positioning them to try to take something, right? Or to do something, accomplish something. And while I'll say that, like, not in every case is that bad, I think there's a wisdom to communication. We should be nuanced. We should be careful with what we say. But usually there's a difference between those two things. When I'm trying to get something out of someone, I may try to literally, verbally, or rhetorically paint them into a corner so that I can either say, aha, gotcha, or try to get them to agree with me because I have painted them so far down into a corner, they're no longer paying attention to all the other possibilities. So just talk about those situations. I'm sure that you guys have opportunities or have had situations and experiences that actually point to this. This is where, as a leader, it's super helpful to show that maybe you did this when you shouldn't have, right? It's one of those things that's like admitting to, yeah, sometimes I do this. And you know that there are people in your life that are probably better with words. They are better at rhetoric. So you could maybe use them as an example, just kindly, of course. But it's important because that's what's happening in this passage. There's a desire to try to catch Jesus. We've seen it try to happen before, but this is one of those big poignant moments. And it's telling, the authors, Matthew's telling us that this is what's happening. Question number 3. Several strategies are at play. We really don't know much about the Herodians, but why would they be important in this conversation? Have you ever had a conversation with someone who wanted you to do something and they brought another person along for effect? Explain. Okay, so the last question has to do with rhetoric specifically, like when using words or you're kind of to get someone to get painted into a corner. There's another strategy that can be used is just bringing someone along, right? You can think about it. One of the simplest ideas here is like, it's kind of like a bully. There's a bully way of doing this, right? Like you have a toady who's not the strong guy, but he goes to his buddy who's bigger and brings them along to have a conversation with you about something, right? So there's an effect of the other person being there, right? There are other ways that this can happen, maybe even in parenting. It's like one of those things where when maybe something has happened and let's just say in a particular family, the mother doesn't take the is not the one who's generally dishing out the punishments, but the father definitely does. Like, that's just the roles that they've decided in the family. And you'll have a mom say to a child who's done something wrong, wait till your father gets home, and then the conversation. It's like when that conversation happens, the very presence of the father makes things different. It's like it's creating an added pressure. Now, in this case, you have this term called Herodians, and I think there's ideas and thoughts of what these people were, but as just a reader, you hear the word Herod, what should be coming to mind? That's the important thing. This is the Herods, the kings that were basically ruling over the whole area of Israel, right? And even a little bit more than that. You have the idea of King Herod himself, the earliest one, who, images from early in the gospel. So there is something about these Herodians that somehow connects them to, call it the kind of the political party of the ones that are in charge. So talk about how, like, you don't have to go too far in like understanding exactly what they are, but understand by bringing them and having a conversation about taxes, what might that do? Like, imagine if, here's the thing. You may do your taxes every year. You might have a CPA do it for you, whatever. But if you get a letter in the mail from the IRS, do you get a little nervous sometimes? Like, we just did this, actually. We just got a letter from the IRS in the mail, and I'm like, oh man, are we going to get audited or something? And it just turns out they were sending it because we had basically filled out my son's college scholarship thing. You fill it out, and it brings information from the IRS, and they're just confirming that did happen, type of thing. So, but you see that there are just the presence of certain parties is creating a level of pressure on a conversation. Okay, so talk about that, because it's something that happens in our life too. It's something that we can understand pretty well. Question number 4. Much of the meaning of the word hypocrites identifies what is happening behind the dialogue in Matthew 22 and 23. What is Jesus saying that his challengers know they should do, but are failing to do? If you think back to the parables, think back to actually a couple sessions ago. One of the questions talked about how the Pharisees are presented with parables, and at the end, Jesus asks them a question, and they answer those questions rightly. They understood the parable, they saw the truth and reality of it, and they answered it, even though it was literally directly showing that they were not doing what they're supposed to do. Right? So if you look at these two chapters as we go, Jesus is pointing to how there is a presented religious authority, right? Whether it be the Pharisees, Sadducees, the high priestly class, anyway, the religious elite, that they are presenting a particular way, but not operating as that way should, right? There's a difference. There is a kind of, this is what we look like, and this is what we're actually doing. So that's the whole idea of this. The wording in Greek, hypocrites, is basically, it's an actor. It's someone who's showing a face that they're acting like something rather than being it, you see. And that leads us perfectly into the next few questions, where Jesus gets into the idea of image or icon, and we'll let those questions kind of flow through. But it's important. Look, you might even go back and look at the parables and see how is Jesus presenting how these Pharisees, scribes, Sadducees, how are they looking, and how are they operating? Question number 5. Read Genesis 1:26 through 31. Discuss what is meant by image and likeness. What is the job of God's image bearers? Try to be exhaustive using this Genesis text. What is at the center of the vocation? I'm going to let you do that, because it's literally just don't go outside. Don't think about things you've been taught necessarily. Read that text and see what is the purpose. If God is saying that that man is made in his image, what does that mean? And this is a giant question, by the way. There's been countless exhaustive books written on this. There is debate and so forth. But just looking at that text, what would you say it is? Because when you start to define out what does it mean to image bear, that gets us a little closer to understanding what Jesus is suggesting that the religious elite of that day were not doing. Okay, so go ahead and take a look. try to find out like all the things, and maybe you can find some implicit things, and I'm going to give you one. So for example, Jesus is placing his image bearers in his creation for the purpose of doing what he does. So there is this vocation of, I mean, you've heard of God spoken as king, right? So you have the triune God of the universe that creates and puts his image bearers in it, and they are supposed to carry like his ideas forward, right? Well, in a sense, that is them being royal. They're carrying the mantle. Like I think of it as vice regent. They're carrying the mantle of the King of the universe, his mantle, not their own, but his mantle into creation, reflecting creation's worship back to him. You can start to think about other things after you get to the specifics, the list of what you'd think the vocation is, and then talk about how that seems to play out. One way you can find that is think about stories in the Bible where someone's doing something wrong. Well, is that something where they're failing to be the image bearer? Okay. Question number 6. Read Colossians 1:15 through 17 and Hebrews 1:1 through 4. How is Jesus' image related back to the Genesis 1 passage discussed earlier? As you look at these two passages, I want you to be thinking about kind of the descriptors of Jesus in them. Like what are the characteristics that are attributed to him. Look at the timing of them and so forth. And you'll start to see that Jesus, as this image bearer, these are like amazing statements about Jesus. And it helps us get to the point that, yeah, he is the exact imprint of God. And that's part of the point, is that Jesus, when he incarnates, he becomes the true human, the one who picks up the image bearingness and the likeness from that. But he was also much more in the sense of being the second person of the Trinity, and he was eternally there, right? But he was the one who was there creating. So you have this huge image that takes Jesus and shows you all of the power in the past and how it's become this perfect image for God. So to talk through that, come up with all of the things that are being spoken about Jesus, because given that he is the perfect image, that fits into the story of this story specifically, right? Because he's getting to these images and saying, hey, whose image is on that? And he says, well, give unto Caesar what Caesar's and unto the Lord what is the Lord's, you see. So we'll get there. Question number 7. Read Romans 8:26 through 30. How does the Apostle Paul describe our image bearing? What are the implications? So in this Romans passage, you're seeing how the Spirit of the living God helps us to actually be conformed to the literal image, the perfect image. So we've established Jesus as being this perfect image of the living God, his Spirit whom he sends to help us live out that we are actually being conformed to that image, that as we move through life, this is possibly another way of looking at sanctification, is we are becoming more and more like Jesus all the time when we are literally in tune with the Spirit who actually helps us and molds us and changes us. So it's one of those things where while we might, I mean, here's the thing, that, let's say 3 years ago, when you were a Christian, you've learned new things. Maybe you've matured. The hope is that you've matured, right? When you become a Christian, you may not have everything together. And even as you go through, you don't have everything together, but you're getting better. You're being conformed more and more into the image of the true image, right? So it's one of those things where it's a growing thing, but it does require us to be thinking about it and interacting with literally the Spirit of God who's showing us the ways through Scripture, through prayer, through other Christians who are actually pouring into us. We're learning what it means to be an image bearer. Question number 8. Think of all those whose image you bear. For example, your mother and father. Or maybe you had an influential grandparent, teacher, or coach that really made an impact on your life. What makes those lives influential to you? How is it you bear the image of these examples? So mother and father is one of the easiest ones, right? You literally carry their DNA. You are you are truthfully conformed into their image in some way. You're kind of a mixture, right? You are this little recipe of the two. Now, maybe some of you are adopted or something like that, but even in that sense, it's the same thing. By being in the environment, the personalities of those two people, mother and father, or if you just had one of them, you are being influenced in a way that forms you kind of like them. Now, I know that some of you may not have had great parental situations, and maybe you are actually being conformed the opposite. Is like whatever you saw in them, you wanted to be something different. And I'd argue, even if that's true, and that may not be a bad thing, you actually probably are still kind of conformed by them. The other thing is that you've got other people in your lives who are influencing you, right? So a good, you can remember your favorite teacher or a coach, or a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle who literally you love them, you saw how they operated, and you wanted to be like them in some sense. And that gets to kind of the heart of this bearing the image of God, is that when you are empowered by the Spirit, you've been saved by this King, the perfect image bearer, you then begin to look more and more like him through the power of his Spirit, who he sends to help us to do so, right? So the question, I mean, that you should probably ask your group on this is like, is that something you want to do? You see what I'm saying? Is like, if you could think back through your life, think of a mentor, a coach, someone who you thought very positively about, they were a really good influence in your life, and you're like, I want to be like them in some way. Do you do the same when it comes to Jesus, right? That's a super good question, because that's the point of Christianity. At the center of our lives is this good news of this King who came and solves our cosmic problem. And he says to live like me, show people what the kingdom is like by how you live, because you're going to live like me. So everything, it's like, I want to be like him. Are we doing that enough? I mean, it's such a powerful thing. It's like, I want to be like my King, because he said, you will be with me. Right? So I want to be in him. I want to be like him. I want to try to do as much as I can to live a life that looks more like his than how I used to be. So this is that part where you can start to say, okay, transition now to Jesus. Like, do you see Jesus as like that positive figure, and how he can actually where you look up to him and want to live a life more like the example that he set. Again, we can't do that perfectly, and not in this lifetime for sure, but the point is that you are being perfected, you are being conformed into an image, so therefore we try to live out of that. Question number 9. What does it mean for you to bear the image of God? Identify specific actions that are part of your vocation. So this would be a good time to go back to that. I believe it's the second question in this session. And now think about all of those things that you considered, like these are things that are part of this vocation, this work of being an image bearer, right? And take those and start to say, well, what does it mean if I'm doing this? Because there are some general categories like prayer and reading your Bible, like knowing God better and things like that, that we all fall into, right? Doesn't mean we have some specific gift in that sense. So for example, we all should evangelize and proclaim the good news to other people. Doesn't mean that I'm an evangelist, but that's a thing that I do. So those are general categories. But then there's some specific ones, which is they're more unique to you, where you are taking the very raw material of your life and you're living it out in a way that points to Jesus and his goodness and his kingdom. So those are specific parts of that vocation. How is it that as a vice regent, as someone who is called to be a royal priest in the name of your king, how is it that you specifically can do that in more ways? And it might be a good time to like just ask people specifically, in what unique ways do you think you are called to live out this life? Because in this story, I mean, it's super powerful. Jesus is saying, it's really, if you're paying really strict attention, you see a coin bears the image of Caesar. It's a graven image. For all intents and purposes, it's a graven image. And they carry those around. They're using them all the time. And Jesus says, render to Caesar what's Caesar. Render to God what is God's. So whose image do you bear? It's almost like that's what Jesus is implying. Whose image do you bear? Render unto God what is God's. Everything. You are to render your whole image, your whole purpose in life, your whole vocation as an image bearer of God is to be living your life out with all of its experiences, both good and bad, all of your skills, all of your gifts, and pointing to him, right? Showing what he's like through all that you are. And it's it's a super powerful thing to have individuals say, well, yeah, I think I'm kind of good in this area, and God's been using it, type of thing, and just encourage people into those gifts, or encourage them out of some people might be, some people just have this feeling that they're like not good at anything, or there's a little bit of this kind of a negative self-image. Try to encourage and draw out and say, God has created us all uniquely. There's a unique recipe in each of us. And that doesn't mean that we're like super good at this or that. It just might mean that literally everything that has been poured into us is designed in some way to help others. And that's true, right? It's just finding those things. So it's encouraging people into living that way. And this gets us to the gospel motivation. And in it, I'm trying to point out that the taxes aren't the important thing. You're actually seeing this picture of the perfect image bearer who's actually been going through like these parables previous, and now showing how the religious elite have missed their vocation. And I think that's an important thing for us to understand, because at the same time, this isn't the end of the story. We know that Jesus ends up going through horrible, torture and death on our behalf. The whole point is he lets all the evil, all of the sin and brokenness to fall on him, so that we could be saved and enabled to do the things that were designed. It's like re-upping our vocation, reminding us this is what image bearing is like. So what is it that you and your group, you should be asking? What are the things where you feel like maybe you've been lazy, maybe you just haven't been even trying and looking for those things? Like, God wants to use us for the glory of his kingdom and himself. And how is it that each of us are specifically and uniquely positioned to do that in particular ways? Are we looking for that? Are we praying? Are we confessing to someone, hey, I've been missing the boat here? Those are the things that you should be kind of trying to focus on during this gospel motivation. Like, what is it what is the things that you feel like, you're feeling this pull of, this is kind of the stuff I'm designed for, and sometimes we neglect it, or maybe some people just haven't figured it out yet, and that's fine. Just encourage them. It's like, God's not done with any of us yet. There's so much more to come. So I pray that your groups go well. I pray that that very Spirit who is actually encouraging us and forming us into that image would be with you, and that you guys would be matured through this process. What a gift it is to be able to spend time with each other and talk about our King and understand him better, and understand ourselves and our own flaws and brokenness, in order to be changed and grow into that image. So have a great week. We'll see you next time.